Story number 1. The Watcher in the Woods. The Appalachian Mountains had always been a place of mystery, a vast stretch of wilderness that seemed to swallow anyone who dared to enter its deep woods. It was the perfect spot for a weekend camping trip, far enough away from the noise of the city, but close enough for a group of friends to make the drive for a quick escape. Jack, Emily, Sarah, and Chris were all in their late 20s, eager for a break from their busy lives, and the idea of the mountains seemed just what they needed. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the thick canopy of trees. The air was cool, the scent of pine and earth filling their lungs as they unloaded their gear. There was a quiet charm to the place, the kind of silence that spoke volumes, except for the occasional rustle of the wind through the leaves or the far-off call of a bird. They set up camp near a small clearing, not too far from a stream that wound its way through the dense forest. The first night was peaceful, filled with the usual chatter and laughter. They cooked their dinner over an open flame, told stories, and even played a few rounds of cards as the darkness crept in. But as the fire flickered low, something about the woods began to feel off. It was hard to put a finger on it, just a subtle unease that seemed to settle in the pit of their stomachs. At first, it was just a feeling, a vague sense that they weren't alone. They'd glance over their shoulders, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows, but nothing ever appeared. The night stretched on, and they eventually retired to their tents, the sound of the stream a soft lullaby in the background. It wasn't until the next morning that the first strange thing happened. Jack was the first to notice the footprints. They were scattered across the clearing, fresh impressions in the soft earth, large and uneven, as if something heavy had passed through during the night. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. Too big to be human, but too deliberate to be animal tracks. He called the others over to inspect them. Probably just some bear or something, Chris suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. But Jack wasn't so sure. The tracks didn't make sense. They didn't seem to lead anywhere, just appearing out of nowhere in the middle of their camp. And as he looked closer, he noticed something else. Something strange about the trees around them. The bark of the nearest one had been scraped away, as if something had dragged its claws across it. The tree itself leaned at an odd angle, its trunk bent unnaturally, like it had been twisted by a force stronger than nature. "Maybe we should pack up and leave," Emily said, her face pale. She had been quiet since the moment she woke up, eyes darting nervously between the woods and the camp. "No," Jack said, shaking his head. "It's probably just a prank. Someone else is out here messing with us." But even as he said it, he wasn't convinced. The air felt different now, thicker, heavier, like something was watching them. The woods didn't feel like a safe place anymore. They spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the feeling of being observed, but it was impossible. It seemed like every crack of a twig, every gust of wind sent their nerves on edge. They hiked a bit deeper into the woods, trying to shake the eerie sensation, but the deeper they went, the stronger it became. The trees grew thicker, the shadows longer, and the feeling of being followed, watched, was overwhelming. And then they found the message. It was carved into the bark of an ancient oak tree, so deep that it seemed almost unnatural. The letters were jagged and uneven, as if scratched into the wood by something desperate, something ancient. "Leave, or you will join us." The words sent a chill down their spines. For a moment, no one spoke. They just stood there, staring at the carving, as if afraid to look away. "Who would do something like this?" Chris whispered. "Doesn't matter," Emily replied, her voice shaky. "We're leaving, now." They turned to go, But when they reached the clearing, their tents were gone. All their gear, their food, their sleeping bags, everything had vanished, as if it had never been there in the first place. In its place were only more of those strange footprints, leading deeper into the forest, far beyond where they had walked before. Panic set in. They ran, the sound of their hurried footsteps mingling with the growing rustle of the trees around them. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in on them. And then, the sounds of their pursuit changed. There was something following them, something big. It moved with unnatural speed, its steps heavy and deliberate. One by one, they disappeared. Emily was the first to go. They heard her scream, a shrill cry that echoed through the trees, but when they rushed toward the sound, she was gone, vanished, as if swallowed whole by the woods. Then it was Chris. He stumbled and fell, and before Jack or Sarah could reach him, some unseen force, pulled him away. His cries were cut off abruptly. Jack and Sarah kept running, but the trees grew more oppressive, the darkness deeper. The creature, whatever it was closing in. And then, in the distance, they saw it. The thing that had been watching them all along. It was an old thing, ancient and twisted, a creature older than time itself. Its body was covered in a patchwork of bark and vines, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. It didn't move like an animal. It was something else, something beyond comprehension. And it was staring directly at them. "Sarah, we need to," Jack started, but his words died in his throat. She was gone. One last scream echoed through the forest, and then silence. The next day, the park rangers found the campsite. They found the footprints, the bent trees, and the carved message on the tree. But there were no signs of Jack, Emily, Chris, or Sarah. Years passed, and the legend of the Watcher in the woods grew. The woods became a place people whispered about, a place where the brave and the foolish dared not venture. But there were always those who ignored the warnings, who thought they could outsmart the woods. And when they disappeared, another message would appear, carved into the bark of an old tree. "Leave, or you will join us." Story number 2. The Old Man's Warning. In the quiet town of Ravenwood, Maine, time seemed to stand still. The streets were lined with old, creaky houses that had seen better days, and the people who lived in them were just as worn as the paint on their shutters. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were a rare sight. Most of the town had lived there their whole lives, or at least for as long as they could remember. But there was one man, an old recluse named Amos Thorne, who lived alone in a small, decaying house at the edge of the woods. No one really knew when he arrived, or why he chose to live so far from the rest of the town, but everyone knew one thing for certain. Amos Thorne was not a man to be ignored. He was a peculiar figure, tall and thin, with a long graying beard and weathered skin that seemed to have been carved from stone. His eyes were cold and distant, as if they had seen things that no one should ever see. He rarely spoke, except when he visited the local tavern, where the older men would gather to pass the time. And when he did speak, his voice was gravelly and low, like the sound of distant thunder. He would sit by the fire, nursing his drink, and tell tales of the woods, tales that most people dismissed as the ramblings of an old man with too much time on his hands. But the stories Amos told were different from the usual small-town gossip. He spoke of a time, many years ago, when creatures like Bigfoot roamed freely in the woods surrounding Ravenwood. He described them as massive, towering beasts, covered in dark fur, with eyes that glowed like fire in the night. According to Amos, these creatures were not the mythical beings that people thought them to be. No, they were real, and they were dangerous. Don't go into the woods at night, Amos would warn anyone who would listen. You disturb them, and you'll wish you never had. Bigfoot, or whatever you want to call them, they're not like the stories say. They're not just big, they're angry. And when they get angry, it's not something you'll want to see. The locals would shake their heads and laugh. Old Amos, he's just a madman, they'd say. He's seen too much time alone out there in that shack of his. He's got the devil in his head, I tell ya. They would pat each other on the back and go about their business, dismissing his warnings as the ramblings of a lonely old man with nothing left to do but scare the young ones with wild tales. But then, one by one, strange things began to happen. It started with the disappearances. People from town would vanish without a trace, gone in the night, leaving behind only the faintest signs of struggle. At first, the townsfolk blamed wild animals or an escaped prisoner from the nearby penitentiary. But as the disappearances grew more frequent, the fear started to creep in. It wasn't long before the strange markings appeared on the trees, deep gouges, like something had clawed at them with a fury that could only belong to something unnatural. And the sound was the worst of all. The howls that echoed through the woods on moonless nights, low and guttural, like something trying to communicate with the darkness itself. Still, the town didn't heed Amos's warnings. People kept walking the woods, taking their chances with the unknown. They were brave, stubborn, and naive. They thought they could handle anything that came their way. But the creature in the woods, the one that Amos had warned them about, wasn't something that could be handled. It wasn't something that could be reasoned with or scared away, and it wasn't alone. It was on a crisp autumn evening when the first real sign of the creature's rage showed itself. A group of teenagers full of bravado decided to test the old man's story. They ventured deep into the woods, armed with nothing but flashlights and their own arrogance. They laughed at the thought of a giant, hairy beast stalking the trees, calling it nothing more than a campfire tale. But that night, the woods didn't stay quiet. The teenagers never came back. The search party found their abandoned camp, but nothing more. Their tents were torn to shreds, and strange tracks, huge, clawed prints, marred the ground around them. And the smell, it was unbearable. A foul, rank odor that lingered in the air long after the search was called off. That's when the townsfolk began to listen, but it was too late. The creature, whatever it was, had tasted blood, and it wasn't going to stop. From that point on, Ravenwood became a place of nightmares. The townspeople huddled in their homes after dark, never daring to venture into the woods. There was talk of forming a militia, of hunting down whatever was out there. But Amos Thorne, who had been quiet for years, came to the town hall meeting and silenced them with a single look. "I told you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You've disturbed it. You've awoken something that was better left sleeping. It doesn't want you to come into its territory. It wants vengeance for something that happened long ago, and now it's coming for us all." No one dared to ask what that sin from the past was. No one wanted to know. The creature came every night after that, leaving behind destruction in its wake. It wasn't just hunting for food, it was hunting for vengeance. The people of Ravenwood began to vanish in the dead of night, one by one, with only signs of violence and claw marks left behind. The town's once bustling streets grew quiet, and the windows of every home were locked tight, as if the town itself was trying to shut out the darkness that was creeping in. Amos, for his part, disappeared soon after. No one knows if he was taken by the creature or if he simply left, knowing that his time had come. But the people of Ravenwood, what was left of them, will never forget the old man's warning. Now, if you visit the town, you'll find nothing but abandoned homes and empty streets. The woods still stand, dark and silent, holding its secrets close. and if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might just hear the sound of something large moving through the trees, its eyes glowing in the dark. It's the creature still out there, waiting for the next person who thinks they can disturb it, and, maybe, the next person who ignores the old man's warning. Here's a prompt you can use to generate an image for the story. A dark, eerie forest on the edge of a small, abandoned town in Maine, with towering trees and a thick fog that blankets the ground. In the distance, a decaying, isolated house stands at the edge of the woods, with a faint light flickering inside. The atmosphere is heavy, ominous, and foreboding, as if something ancient and dangerous lurks just out of sight. Shadowy, glowing eyes peek out from the darkness of the trees, hinting at an unseen creature. The forest feels alive with menace, as if it's waiting for something to stir. Story number 3. Tracks in the Snow. The storm came in fast, as they always did in the winter. It was supposed to be just a small flurry, a dusting, but it turned into something worse. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a thing alive, and the snow started falling in thick, heavy sheets. By the time they realized how bad it was, the world outside had vanished under a blanket of white, and their cabin, little more than a small wooden box in the middle of nowhere, was cut off from the rest of the world. Brian Grant stood at the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he looked out at the swirling white darkness. His wife, Karen, was huddled in front of the fire, trying to keep their 2 kids entertained. Ben was 5, his wide eyes fixed on the little toys scattered around the room, while Lucy, only 9, was lost in a book, her face pale and serious, as if the world outside didn't exist at all. They were safe for now. The storm had trapped them in the cabin, but they had plenty of firewood, enough canned goods to last a week, and the promise of a few days of isolation to reconnect as a family. But Brian couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping up his spine. "Think it'll pass soon?" Karen asked, glancing up from the fire. She didn't sound worried, but Brian could see it in her eyes. The same tightness, the same lingering question that had been hanging in the air since they first arrived here. "I'll go check the supplies," he said, his voice rough. "Make sure we've got enough. Stay inside with the kids. I won't be long." Karen nodded, though her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than usual, as if she was reading something in his face that he wasn't aware of. Brian grabbed his coat, bundled himself up in layers of wool, and stepped outside into the white abyss. The cold hit him immediately, the kind of cold that felt like it was cutting straight to the bone. He fought against the wind as he made his way around the back of the cabin to the shed where they kept the extra firewood and the snowshoes. The storm was relentless, the snow whipping around him in every direction. But as he trudged through the deepening snow, he noticed something strange. There were footprints, massive, deep impressions in the snow, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the woods. Brian stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. They weren't animal tracks. Too large, too uneven, like nothing he'd ever seen before. They were too wide, the toes splayed out in an unnatural way, and the depth of the print suggested something far heavier than any animal could possibly be. His breath came in sharp, rapid bursts as he studied the tracks, his mind racing to make sense of it. Had someone come out here? But no, that didn't make sense. They hadn't seen a soul since they'd arrived, and no one else lived for miles in any direction. It had to be something else. But what? Suddenly, the wind howled louder, almost like a warning, and the snow began falling harder, blurring his vision. Brian turned, heading back toward the cabin as quickly as he could. The tracks in the snow were still there, leading into the woods, but now the snow was coming down so fast, it would be hard to make them out for long. He needed to get inside. Inside, Karen was already by the window, her face pale. The kids had stopped playing, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the tension that had filled the room with an invisible weight. "What is it?" Karen asked, her voice tight with fear. "There's something out there," Brian said, his voice trembling despite himself. "Some kind of creature, I don't know what, but it's big, too big." Karen's eyes widened, and she pulled Ben and Lucy closer to her. Brian turned away from the window, trying to steady his breath. The storm was only getting worse, the wind screaming through the walls of the cabin. But it wasn't just the storm that made the air feel thick. It was something else. Something dark, something old. As the hours passed, the wind didn't let up. The cabin shook under the force of it, the snow falling harder than ever. The world outside had become a blur, and Brian could feel the temperature dropping. But it wasn't the cold that made his stomach churn. It was the feeling that something was waiting, watching. "Dad?" Lucy asked, her voice small. "Are we safe?" Brian didn't answer right away. He couldn't. He wasn't sure they were safe. Something was wrong. Something was coming. The storm raged through the night, and by morning, the world outside was still buried beneath a heavy white silence. But Brian knew the creature was out there. He could feel it, just beyond the reach of the cabin's warmth, in the deep woods where the tracks had led. It was waiting, just as it had waited before. "I'm going out," Brian said, his voice low and steady. Karen's face went ashen. "What? No, Brian, you can't." "I have to," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I have to know what it is. We have to know what it wants." Reluctantly, Karen nodded, her face tight with fear. Brian put on his coat again, the weight of it heavier this time, the sense of dread curling in his gut. He stepped outside, the cold biting his skin immediately. The snow had piled up over the footprints, but the tracks were still there, faint but visible in the soft morning light. They were closer now, much closer. He followed the tracks, his heart pounding with every step, until he reached the trees where the snow was undisturbed. The air was thick with the sense of something watching him. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of wind made him jump. And then he saw it, the massive shape moving slowly through the trees. It wasn't an animal, it wasn't human, it was something in between, something ancient and primal. And then he saw it, the thing that had come for them, the thing that had followed them all this way. Its eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Brian realized something that had been buried in the back of his mind for years. The creature wasn't here by accident. It wasn't here because of the storm. It was here because of him. The sins of his past, the things he had done, the things he had buried deep, had awakened something far worse than he could ever have imagined. And now, it had come to claim him. Brian turned and ran, the sound of the creature's pursuit growing closer with every step. He didn't know if he'd make it back to the cabin. He didn't know if any of them would survive. But he knew one thing for sure. The storm was nothing compared to the terror that was about to descend on them. And the tracks in the snow had led them all straight into the mouth of hell. Story number 4. The Dark Hollow. It was the kind of place where you learned not to ask questions. The people of Glenwood, a small town tucked away in the shadow of the forest, knew better than to venture near the Dark Hollow. They didn't need to know why. They didn't need to hear any more stories about it. It was a place to avoid, plain and simple. But for Ethan Crawford, it was exactly the story he needed. Ethan had always been the kind of guy who felt like he needed more. More adventure, more excitement, more stories. He had just landed a job at the local paper, a small, struggling outlet that was desperate for anything that would draw attention. And Ethan, young, ambitious, and hungry for recognition, was determined to deliver. He needed something big, something that would make his name. That's when he heard the story about the Dark Hollow, It was a story that had been told for generations in Glenwood. The old-timers would whisper about it in the corners of the tavern or over the counters at the general store. They'd speak of strange lights flickering in the woods, of people who'd disappeared without a trace, of strange things heard in the night. They'd tell him to stay away, to not be stupid. Some places, they'd say, just aren't meant to be messed with. But Ethan wasn't the type to be swayed by superstitions. He knew the legends were just that, legends, and there was no better way to prove it than to go and see for himself. So, one crisp morning in early spring, he packed his bag, grabbed his camera, and set off for the dark hollow. The walk through the woods wasn't long. It was only a few miles from the edge of town, but the path became less clear the further he went. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting overhead, blocking out the sun. A strange chill settled over him as the air grew still, almost unnatural. Even the birds had stopped chirping. Ethan pushed on, ignoring the creeping sense of unease in his stomach. He was here for a reason. This was his big break. When he finally reached the hollow, it wasn't what he expected. He thought it would be just a regular, darkened part of the woods, but it was more like a wound in the earth, an unnatural indentation in the land, as if something had been ripped from it long ago. The trees around the hollow were twisted and blackened, their roots curling out of the soil like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with dampness, the smell of rot hanging in the air. But it wasn't the hollow itself that made Ethan's heart race. It was what lay inside it. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing, was a strange stone altar, old, moss-covered, and weathered by time. It seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if it were waiting for something. Ethan felt an inexplicable pull toward it, an urge to step closer, but he hesitated, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Something didn't feel right. Then he saw it. Fossilized bones lay scattered around the altar. Human, animal, maybe something else altogether. They were old, but not ancient. The kind of bones that told stories of death not long past. His camera clicked as he captured the scene, but his hand trembled as he snapped the photos. He felt something watching him, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there, and that's when he saw the eyes. Two gleaming orbs, glowing faintly, watching him from the darkness of the trees. They were too big to be human, too wide, too strange. They didn't blink, they didn't move. They just stared, unblinking, as if they were studying him. And in that moment, Ethan knew, he knew with every bone in his body, that he wasn't alone. A noise, low and guttural, rumbled from the depths of the hollow. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was something deeper, something older, something that had been waiting for him to stumble into its territory. Panic seized him. Ethan turned and bolted, running back the way he came, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop to look back, but he could feel the eyes on him, as if something was right behind him, breathing down his neck. The sound of footsteps, heavy, thumping, echoed in his ears, though when he turned, there was nothing there. The hollow was silent again, but the feeling of being hunted didn't leave him. He made it back to town, breathless, shaking. He tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, but the image of those eyes, glowing in the dark, wouldn't leave him. He locked himself in his apartment that night, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside made him jump. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him back from the hollow. Days passed, and Ethan tried to go on with his life. He developed the photos from his trip, and though the images of the bones in the altar came out clear, there was something off about them. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be. The images of the trees looked twisted, distorted. But it wasn't until he looked at the last picture, the one where he had caught the eyes watching him, that he understood. The photo was clear, too clear. Those eyes weren't just glowing. They were following him. He started to see things. Figures in the corners of his vision. Shadows that didn't belong. Whispers in the dead of night. The images of the hollow haunted his every waking moment. And when he looked out the window, sometimes he thought he could see something moving in the dark. Something huge, something unnatural. But it wasn't the visions that terrified him the most. It was what happened next. One morning, as Ethan stepped out into the street, he found the first sign. A single, massive footprint, half covered in dirt and leaves, right in the middle of the road. It was too big to be human, too wide, too deep. And when he looked up, standing just beyond the tree line, he saw it. A shape, tall and dark, its eyes glowing faintly in the shadow. It wasn't a man, it wasn't an animal. It was something old, something ancient, that had been watching him ever since he entered the dark hollow. Ethan knew then that it wasn't just the hollow he had disturbed. He had awoken something far worse, a presence that had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment. And now it was coming for him. It had followed him back to the town. And it wasn't just him it wanted. The dark hollow was calling to him, and this time, it wasn't letting go. Story number 5. The Beast of Blackwater Creek. In the small town of Willows Hollow, tucked between hills and forests that seemed to go on forever, no one thought much about the stories of the Beast of Blackwater Creek. It was just a legend, a tale passed down by the old-timers over cold beers and warm fires. They said it was a creature, half man, half monster, who lived deep in the woods, hiding from the world, only coming out when the moon was high and the air was thick with fear. But the town didn't pay it much mind. People had more important things to worry about, like paying bills, fixing leaky roofs, and trying to get by in a town that seemed stuck in time. But then, one night, everything changed. It started with a scream. On the edge of town, in a small house where the trees grew so thick they blocked out the sun, a man was found dead. His body had been torn apart, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, and his chest had been ripped open like a wild animal had gotten to him. The sheriff, James Galloway, was the first to arrive at the scene. He'd seen his fair share of bloodshed in his years on the force, but this was something different. Something that made his skin crawl. Sheriff Galloway wasn't new to the town, though. He had grown up here, and he had lived through the legends. He'd heard about the Beast of Blackwater Creek his whole life, but he had always dismissed it as just that. Stories. But as he stood in front of the mangled body, something in the back of his mind began to click. It wasn't just the brutality of the murder. It was the feeling that something old, something unnatural, was at play here. It was like the air itself was charged, heavy with something that had been dormant for far too long. Sheriff, his deputy, Mark, called to him from across the room. "You should see this." Galloway turned, his heart pounding in his chest. Mark was kneeling by the back door, where the tracks in the mud were still visible, leading into the woods. They weren't human. They were too wide, too deep, and they were unmistakably large, bigger than any man could make. "Are those—" Mark didn't finish his sentence. He didn't need to. "They're Bigfoot tracks," Galloway said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd heard the stories, sure, but he'd always written them off as just that, stories. But the tracks were real, and something else, something dark, was lurking behind them. Galloway hadn't always been a sheriff. Once, he had been a young man with a life ahead of him, a future that had been torn apart by the sudden disappearance of his brother Tom. Tom had been the daring one. the one who went out into the woods, into the heart of Blackwater Creek, and never came back. The town had searched for him for days, weeks, but there had been no sign of him, no trace. It was like the woods had swallowed him whole. His family had never recovered from it, and neither had Galloway. He had always suspected that something unnatural had happened to Tom, but no one believed him. No one wanted to believe that something as wild as the beast of Blackwater Creek was real. The sheriff had to push those thoughts to the back of his mind. But now, as he stood at the scene of another brutal death, those old memories came rushing back. This was no random act of violence. This was something much darker, much older. Galloway knew the townspeople would want answers, but the answers didn't lie in human hands. They lay in the woods. Over the next few days, more deaths followed. More bodies, more mutilated remains. All the victims had one thing in common. They were close to the woods, close to Blackwater Creek, and they all bore the same savage marks, the signs of something that had claws, teeth, and strength beyond human understanding. Galloway couldn't shake the feeling that the beast was not just hunting. It was sending a message that was too old to ignore. He dug deeper, revisiting the stories from his childhood, trying to find a connection between the murders and the creature that had haunted his nightmares. It didn't take long for him to uncover something terrifying. The town of Willows Hollow wasn't just built on land. It was built on an ancient evil. The beast wasn't some isolated creature. It was part of something much larger, something that had been in the area long before the first settlers arrived. The creature was bound to the land, and to the town's history, a history filled with blood, violence, and dark rituals that had been long forgotten by most of the town. The deeper Galloway dug, the more he found. He uncovered old journal entries from a man who had lived here in the early days of the town's founding. This man, a settler named Samuel Hawkins, had written about a pact made with something in the woods, a deal that promised prosperity and safety in exchange for blood. The ritual had been performed on the very land that now housed Willows Hollow, and it was said to have summoned something monstrous. The creature had been bound by the pact, but the pact had come with a price. It had to feed, and it fed on the people who lived in the town. Galloway's stomach turned as he read through the pages. His brother Tom, he had come too close to the truth. He had gone out to Blackwater Creek, seeking something, maybe answers, maybe fame. But he had found something far worse. The beast had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. And now, it was taking again. Galloway knew what he had to do. He gathered a group of the bravest men in town, men who were willing to risk everything to put an end to the creature's reign. Armed with nothing but rifles and old knowledge, they set off into the woods, following the trail of destruction that the beast had left behind. The hunt was long and grueling, and the closer they got to Blackwater Creek, the thicker the air became, heavy with the scent of decay, thick with a presence that made every hair on Galloway's neck stand on end. They reached the creek just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and there, standing in the clearing, was the beast. It was massive, its eyes glowing like embers, its fur matted and torn, its claws longer than any human's. But it wasn't just the beast that stood before them. It was the embodiment of the town's sins. It was the price of the pact made so many years ago. And as Galloway looked into its eyes, he realized that killing the creature wouldn't be enough. The evil had already taken root in the town. It had always been there. It was part of them now, part of their history. And no matter how many people they killed, the beast would always return. As the first shot rang out, Galloway realized there was no escaping what had been unleashed. The town's past had come alive, and the beast of Blackwater Creek would continue to haunt Willows Hollow for generations to come. The evil was far from over. Story number 6. The Hairy Ones. The town of Pine Hollow had always been quiet. So quiet, in fact, that it was easy to forget it was even there. Nestled between thick forests and rolling hills, Pine Hollow was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. People knew each other's names, and the biggest scandal was usually someone's cow getting loose on the wrong side of the fence. Life moved slowly, like the trickling creek that wound through the woods behind the town. But that peace was shattered when the animals started dying. It started small at first. A few chickens gone missing. A dog found dead on the outskirts of town, its body mutilated in ways that couldn't be explained. Then the deer started turning up, their carcasses abandoned in the woods, stripped of all flesh, their bones bleached white by the sun. People whispered about it at first. Maybe a bear or a mountain lion was to blame. But then the disappearances began. First, it was a few stray cats and dogs, then a farmer's son. After that, it was the daughter of the local grocery store owner, and still, no one knew what was going on. The town was terrified, and the sheriff, a man named Charlie Hayes, was at a loss. He'd seen his fair share of strange things, but this was beyond his understanding. No tracks were left behind, no signs of struggle, just the dead animals and the missing people. The entire town started locking their doors at night. They stopped letting their children play outside after dark. The air was thick with fear, and even the air seemed to be getting colder. Then came the group of teenagers, Adam, Jenny, Will, and Laura. They were sick of hiding in fear, sick of the whispers that filled every room in town. They didn't believe the rumors about monsters or ghosts or anything supernatural. They thought the town was just being paranoid. So, they decided to do something about it. They would go into the woods. They would find out what was happening, and they would prove that there was a rational explanation. They set out one evening, backpacks filled with snacks, flashlights, and cameras. They made their way down the path that led into the forest, their hearts racing with a mix of excitement and fear. Adam, the leader of the group, led the way, his flashlight cutting through the dense underbrush. "This is crazy," Jenny muttered, glancing nervously around the darkening trees. "We're just kids. What if we're wrong about all this?" "We're not wrong," Adam said confidently, though even he wasn't sure. "We'll find out what's really going on. No one's ever going to believe us unless we have proof." As they walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the town faded behind them. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunching of their boots on the dry leaves. The air grew colder, and the deeper they went, the more uneasy they felt. The trees began to feel closer, tighter, as if they were being watched. Then they found it. It wasn't much at first, a broken branch here, a strange indentation in the dirt there. But as they moved further into the woods, they found something that stopped them in their tracks. Huge footprints, easily twice the size of a man's, leading off the path and into the thickest part of the forest. The prints were deep, as if something heavy had walked there recently, and they were unlike anything any of them had ever seen. Will, the skeptic of the group, knelt down to examine the print. That's not human," he said, his voice shaky. "What the hell is that?" "It's Bigfoot," Laura said quietly, almost to herself. The words hung in the air, too big to take back. No one said anything for a long moment. The group followed the tracks, their nerves tight, every snap of a twig making them jump. They didn't know what they were expecting to find, but they were sure it wasn't what they found next. Hidden in a small clearing was a family of them. Bigfoot. The creatures were massive, covered in dark, matted fur. There were 3 of them, 2 adults and a smaller one, no more than 5 or 6 feet tall. They stood in front of a strange, hollowed-out tree, something that looked almost like a dwelling. Their eyes were dark, intense, like they were watching the kids from the shadows, but they didn't move. Not at first. Adam's heart hammered in his chest. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They're real." Jenny's breath caught in her throat. "We should go. We should go right now." But it was too late. One of the creatures stepped forward, its massive form emerging from the shadows. Its eyes were not just animalistic, they were calculating, intelligent. And the moment it locked eyes with Adam, something strange happened. The world around him shifted. The trees around him seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways, like they were reaching for him. The air became thick, as if it were pressing down on his chest. "Adam," Jenny's voice sounded far away. "Adam, look at me." But Adam couldn't look away from the creature. Its gaze held him, and the world around him seemed to distort even more, the trees becoming darker, more twisted. A low, guttural sound vibrated in his mind, not through his ears. He heard words, thoughts. He wasn't sure if they were his own or the creature's. "You shouldn't have come here. You should have stayed in the town. You've seen us now. And now we will see you." The words weren't spoken aloud, but they filled his mind like a dark cloud, pressing in, suffocating him. His body tensed, but he couldn't move. He couldn't speak. Suddenly, he snapped out of it. The world returned to normal. At least, he thought it did. The creature had stepped back, and the others were staring at him, fear in their eyes. But Adam could still feel it. Something was wrong. The creature hadn't just been looking at him. It had been in his head, twisting his thoughts, controlling him. "We need to go," Adam said, his voice shaky. "Now." But it was too late. The creatures began to move, not toward them, but away from them. And as they did, the ground beneath the teens' feet began to tremble. The world around them seemed to shake, as if the forest itself was alive, angry, and unwilling to let them leave. And in the distance, the low, deep growl of the creatures echoed in their minds once more. "You have seen us. Now you will remember us." The teens ran, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't stop until they were back at the edge of the town, panting and terrified, unable to explain what had happened. They had seen the hairy ones. And worse, they had felt their power. But as they lay in their beds that night trying to sleep, Adam could still feel it. The creatures were still in his head, whispering, manipulating. The town of Pine Hollow was no longer a place of peace. It was a place where the hairy ones had watched for centuries. And now, they knew the teens' minds too. They were part of the town now. And nothing would ever be the same again. Story number 7. Echoes of the Forgotten. The Pacific Northwest was known for its vast, untouched beauty, dense forests, towering mountains, and tranquil lakes that seemed to stretch on forever. But there was one place, deep in the heart of it all, that no one spoke of. A remote national park that had been closed off for decades. The reason for its closure was always vague, a quiet rumor that it had been taken over by wildlife disturbances. Most people accepted it without question. After all, the government had its reasons, right? But a group of thrill-seeking hikers didn't buy it. They were looking for adventure, something more exciting than the usual, crowded trails that brought tourists from all over. They'd heard whispers of the park, whispers of things hidden in the woods, of creatures that roamed where no one dared to go. It was the perfect challenge, the perfect story to tell when they returned. There were 5 of them. Caleb, the leader of the group, a fearless adventurer who loved the idea of danger. Emma, his girlfriend, always ready for a thrill. Marcus and Sarah, the couple who followed along for the ride, their curiosity and excitement outweighing their caution. And finally, Alex, the quiet one, the most skeptical, but the one who always ended up in the thick of things. They sneaked into the park on a late afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the jagged peaks of the mountains. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the kind of fresh wilderness air that made you feel alive. They slipped through the fences that had been knocked down over the years, not caring about the no trespassing signs that had long since faded into the landscape. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization faded away. The only noise was the crunch of their boots against the forest floor and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. They had no map, no real plan, just a sense of daring that drove them forward. Hours passed as they hiked further into the heart of the park. The sun was long gone by the time they found the first strange sign: bones. At first, it didn't seem like much, just a few scattered animal remains. Raccoons, deer, maybe a bear. But then they noticed something unsettling. The bones weren't just left there. They were arranged in a pattern, a deliberate formation, almost like some kind of symbol or ritualistic arrangement. The bones were cleaned of flesh, bleached white by the elements, but they still gave off a chilling, unnatural feeling. Caleb squatted down, studying the arrangement, his flashlight flickering across the jagged pieces. "What do you think this means?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. Emma kneeled beside him, her eyes wide with unease. "This isn't normal," she whispered. "No animal would do this. It's like someone or something placed them here on purpose." Alex, standing a few feet away, was starting to feel the weight of the strange atmosphere. "We should go," he said, his voice tight. "This place gives me the creeps. It doesn't feel right." But Caleb was determined. He brushed off Alex's warning with a wave of his hand. "It's probably just some old hunter's trap, or maybe it's just the local wildlife. We're fine." They continued to press forward, though the unease began to settle in their stomachs like a stone. The woods around them were silent now, too silent. Even the animals had stopped making noise. It was as though the forest was holding its breath. Then they heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, reverberating off the mountain ridges in the distance. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a wolf or anything they could recognize. It was something deeper, something older, something that didn't belong. Marcus froze, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. The growl came again, closer this time. And this time, they all heard it. A deep, rumbling noise that seemed to vibrate in their bones. It was followed by the sound of something massive moving through the underbrush, snapping twigs and rustling leaves with unnatural force. "Run!" Caleb shouted, and without thinking they turned and began to flee. The air felt different now, thick, oppressive. As they sprinted through the darkening woods, their flashlights flickering, the growls followed them, growing louder with each step. But it wasn't just the sound of the creature that scared them, it was the feeling. It was as though something was watching them, stalking them, just beyond the trees. The growls were closing in, but it wasn't just the physical presence of the creature. There was something else, something wrong. As they rounded a bend, Sarah screamed, "Marcus! Marcus, look!" She pointed ahead, her face pale with terror. At the center of a clearing, a massive, hulking shape emerged from the shadows. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the faint light of their flashlights. The creature was tall, its body covered in dark fur, its muscles bulging beneath the thick coat. But what made it worse than any animal they had ever seen was the way it stood, unnaturally still, as though it was waiting for them to make the first move. It was the creature's eyes that sent a chill up their spines. There was no warmth in them, no sign of intelligence, just a blank, primal hunger. Caleb's breath hitched in his throat. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. But as he turned to run, the woods seemed to shift. The trees bent in strange, impossible angles. The shadows seemed to close in around them, and the ground beneath their feet felt like it was shifting, changing. "No," a voice echoed in his mind. Not spoken, but felt, cold, deep, ancient. "You cannot leave." The growls came again, and this time they were all around them. The creature wasn't just following them. It was in their heads, twisting their thoughts, making them see things that weren't there, hear sounds that didn't exist. It was messing with their minds, slowly eroding their grip on reality. "Get out of my head!" Emma screamed, clutching her temples as if trying to hold herself together. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the trees groaned as though the forest itself was alive, responding to the creature's call. The group was trapped. They couldn't find their way out. The forest wasn't the same as it had been when they entered. The paths no longer made sense. The creature had them in its grasp, and it was too powerful to fight. Their only hope now was to understand what it wanted. And as they stumbled through the woods, desperately trying to find an escape, they began to uncover something far darker than they had ever imagined. An ancient history buried deep in the land. A history of sacrifices, of rituals performed by those who came before them, binding the creature to the land itself. The truth was clear now. The creature had always been there, guarding the land against intruders. And as they tried to escape, they realized that the only way out was to uncover the dark history of the land itself and hope that it would let them go. But in the end, the creature had been waiting for them, waiting for centuries, and it would never let them leave. Story number 8. The Last Frontier. The Alaskan wilderness had always been a place of mystery and legend. Towering mountains, endless forests and glaciers that seemed to go on forever. An unforgiving land that could swallow you whole without leaving a trace. For decades, people had whispered about creatures lurking in the shadows, but most dismissed them as myths. Stories told to keep children in bed at night. Bigfoot, they called it. The ape-like creature that supposedly roamed the deepest parts of the forests. Dr. Marcus Hale and his team of researchers were determined to prove that Bigfoot was nothing more than a tall tale. They were scientists, after all, rational, logical. They'd heard the stories, but they knew better. They had their equipment, cameras, sensors, and the best survival gear money could buy. They had spent months planning the expedition, charting out a path into a remote area of Alaska's vast wilderness. Their mission was clear: study the terrain, catalog the wildlife, and, if they were lucky, collect evidence that Bigfoot was just a figment of imagination. But when they arrived, things weren't quite as they expected. The land felt wrong. Even for the most seasoned outdoorsman, there was an overwhelming sense of unease. It wasn't just the weather, the bitter cold, the constant wind that never seemed to stop. It was something in the air, something in the trees. It felt as though the land itself was watching them. The team consisted of 5 people: Marcus, the leader, a confident and ambitious researcher; Emma, the field expert, a quiet, no-nonsense woman who was always prepared for any situation; Tim, the cameraman, who had joined the team for the thrill of being in the wild; Jessica, the biologist, who had a fascination with the untamed ecosystems of the North; and Ben, the youngest of the group, eager to prove himself in the field. The first few days were uneventful, but there was a strange tension in the air. The silence of the wilderness was suffocating. There were no birds singing, no squirrels chattering. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the crunch of their boots in the snow. As they trekked deeper into the wilderness, the sense of isolation became more pronounced. It wasn't until the 5th night that things started to go wrong. Tim had gone out to set up a camera near a small clearing when he disappeared. At first, they thought he might have gotten lost. He was always a bit too eager, rushing ahead without considering the dangers of the land. But when he didn't return by nightfall, the worry started to creep in. The team split up and searched the area, but there was no sign of Tim. No footprints, no tracks in the snow. Just an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The following day, with no sign of Tim and no explanation for his disappearance, Marcus called for the team to regroup at their base camp. He tried to stay calm, but his mind was racing. It was hard to ignore the thought that something out there was watching them. Something was out of place. "We're not going to leave him behind," Marcus said, though his voice wavered. "We'll go out again tomorrow. We'll find him." But as the hours dragged on, their resolve began to weaken. The wind howled louder that night, shaking their tents, and the snow began to fall in sheets. The landscape became even more desolate, the trees darker and more twisted. That night, as they huddled in their tents, the sound of something moving outside sent a chill down their spines. It wasn't just the wind, it was something bigger, something heavier. The next day, things only got worse. At first light, they noticed something strange. Large footprints leading away from the camp. But they weren't animal tracks. They were far too large to be from any bear or moose, and the way they were spaced out almost deliberately made their blood run cold. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward a mountain pass that the team had been warned to avoid. Despite their better judgment, they decided to follow the tracks. As they ventured further into the wilderness, the boundary between predator and prey started to blur. They heard the growls, low and guttural, echoing through the trees. It wasn't just the sound of an animal. It was the sound of something intelligent, something that knew they were there and wasn't afraid to make its presence known. The deeper they went, the more the land seemed to close in on them. The snow fell heavier, and the trees grew more dense. They were no longer following a trail. They were running from something. From the creature that had taken Tim. The growls grew louder, closer, and when they looked over their shoulders, they caught glimpses of movement in the shadows. Large, hulking figures that seemed to dart between the trees, just out of reach. By the time night fell again, they were all terrified. The isolation was starting to break them down. Ben had started to mumble about hearing voices in the wind, and Jessica had fallen silent, her eyes constantly darting around, searching the dark woods for something she couldn't name. Emma kept looking over her shoulder, her breath quickening. They couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The creature, whatever it was, had begun to stalk them, toying with them. It wasn't a hunt, it was something worse. Something that wanted to make them feel powerless. By the 4th day, Marcus knew they weren't going to make it out alive. The monster that had taken Tim wasn't just a creature. It was something ancient. It was built for this land, for this isolation, and it knew how to drive its prey to the edge of madness. They weren't just fighting the wilderness anymore. They were fighting something that had lived in these woods long before humans ever stepped foot in it. And then, on the 5th night, they saw it. Through the darkness, they saw its eyes, glowing faintly in the blackness of the trees, watching them. It was tall, its body covered in dark, matted fur. It moved silently, impossibly fast, like a shadow blending into the night. They tried to run, but it was too late. The creature was faster, stronger. It picked them off one by one, not with brute force, but with a precision that left them helpless. The last thing Marcus remembered was the face of the creature, its eyes burning with an intelligence that sent terror straight to his soul. And then, nothing. Days later, a search party was sent out to find the missing team. They found the camp, abandoned, with nothing left but broken equipment and empty tents. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just the haunting silence of the Alaskan wilderness. The only thing they found were the footprints. Massive, deep imprints in the snow that led into the mountain pass. And then, nothing. No more tracks. No more traces of the team that had come, convinced they could tame the wilderness. The Alaskan wilderness had claimed them, and it would claim anyone else who dared to enter the last frontier. Story number 9. The Shapeshifter. For over 15 years, Dave Hollis had hunted Bigfoot, not just casually like some weekend warrior or curious tourist. No, Dave had devoted his life to tracking the creature. He had spent countless hours in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, following rumors, chasing whispers, and piecing together the cryptic sightings of the elusive beast. His obsession had become his life. It had cost him relationships, friends, and most of his sanity. But for Dave, it was the only thing that mattered: catching Bigfoot. He had seen things. Strange footprints in the dirt, branches broken in ways that only a creature of immense strength could manage, and hair that didn't belong to any known animal. But he'd never seen the creature itself, not up close anyway. He'd come close a few times. Once, he thought he had caught a glimpse of it through the trees. A hulking figure, covered in dark hair, moving silently through the forest. But every time he thought he was getting closer, it slipped away, just out of reach. It was the hunt that kept him going. The promise that one day he would finally corner the beast and prove to the world that Bigfoot wasn't just a myth. But all that changed one cold autumn night. Dave had been tracking a lead for weeks. A fresh set of tracks he'd found deep in the woods, near a mountain pass that had been a dead zone for other hunters. Something felt different about these tracks. They were recent, and the prints were massive, much larger than the ones he had followed in the past. The hair was thick and dark, a strange mix of black and brown, and it seemed to shimmer in the fading light of dusk. He'd set up camp near the trail, hoping to catch the creature in the act. He had his rifle, his camera, and a flashlight. But deep down, he knew none of that would be enough to bring Bigfoot down. He had learned long ago that this creature was no simple animal. It was intelligent, cunning, and elusive. But tonight something felt off. The air was too still, the woods were too quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the calls of birds, were all absent. Even the wind had died down, leaving an unnatural silence hanging over everything. That night, as he lay in his tent, he heard it. A rustling outside, the sound of something heavy moving through the brush. At first, he thought it was just an animal, a deer or a bear, but then he heard something else. A voice, a low, guttural voice that wasn't quite human. "Dave," the voice whispered, echoing in the stillness of the night. His heart skipped a beat. He sat up in his tent, his breath catching in his throat. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The voice didn't answer, but the rustling continued, getting closer and closer to his camp. Dave grabbed his rifle and unzipped the tent, stepping into the cold night air. His flashlight swept over the forest, but there was nothing. No sign of movement, no creature lurking in the shadows. The only thing he could see was the flickering light of his campfire, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. But then he saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, taller than any man, even taller than the Bigfoot he had been tracking for years. It was covered in dark, matted fur, its face a blur in the darkness. Dave raised his rifle, his hands trembling. Bigfoot," he whispered to himself. "It's really here." But as he stepped forward, something changed. The creature began to shift, its form contorting and twisting in the flickering light. Its fur melted away, and the features of a man began to emerge. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that was eerily familiar. Dave's breath caught in his throat. The man standing before him was someone he hadn't seen in years. His old hunting partner, Thomas McAllister, who had gone missing in these very woods 5 years ago. He had been one of Dave's closest friends, someone who had shared his obsession with Bigfoot, someone who had disappeared without a trace during a hunt. They had searched for days, but there had been no sign of him, just the eerie silence of the forest. But here he was, standing in front of Dave, alive, breathing, and staring at him with the same cold eyes that had haunted his dreams. "Thomas?" Dave whispered, his voice breaking. "Is it really you?" The figure smiled, grinned, its face stretching into something unnatural. The smile was too wide, too perfect, like it was forced. "I'm not Thomas," the creature said, its voice low and gravelly, "but I can be." Dave stumbled back, his mind racing. He didn't understand what he was seeing. The creature's face shifted again, warping and twisting until it became someone else. Another person Dave had known, someone he had lost long ago. His mother, his father. Faces of people he had known in his life, all coming and going in an instant, each one more terrifying than the last. The creature was playing with him, using his memories to twist his reality. "You're not real," Dave said, his voice trembling. "You're just in my head." But the creature laughed. "Am I? Or are you just too weak to see the truth?" Dave's mind was spiraling. The creature had killed his friends, had killed Thomas, and now it was using them against him. It wasn't just stalking the woods, it was playing with his mind, manipulating him. It knew his fears, his regrets, and it was feeding on them. He raised his rifle, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim. The creature, this shapeshifter, was everywhere. He didn't know if he was seeing the real thing anymore or if it had completely broken him. Was it the creature, or was it his own mind playing tricks on him? The line between predator and prey had blurred completely. "You can't escape me," the creature whispered, its voice now 1,000 voices, all calling out at once. "You're mine." Dave fired into the darkness, but the creature was already gone, vanishing into the night like smoke. He didn't know how long he stayed out there, staring into the forest, waiting for the next trick, the next shape to emerge. By the time dawn broke, he had collapsed by the campfire, exhausted and broken. But even as the sunlight pierced the trees, he knew the truth. He hadn't been hunting Bigfoot. He had been hunting himself all along. The shapeshifter had won. And it wasn't just a creature. It was his own fears, his regrets, his past. And it would never let him go. Story number 10. The Return of the Forgotten. The town of Pine Ridge was a quiet, unassuming place. Nestled deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, it had lived in relative peace for generations. The people of Pine Ridge were tough, logging families who had spent decades working the land, carving their lives into the rough timber of the woods. The town's history was simple and rooted in hard work. But there was one thing no one spoke about: the things that had been buried, forgotten. It all started when a crew of loggers, led by a man named Sam Carson, stumbled upon something they shouldn't have. It was late in the fall, and the air had already turned sharp with the bite of winter. The men had been working on clearing a new section of the forest, one that had been marked for logging for years but had always been avoided. The elders of the town, those who remembered their grandparents' stories, had warned them about the spot. "Leave it be," they'd say. "The land's not right there." But Sam Carson wasn't the type to believe in superstition. He'd heard the stories, sure, but in a town like Pine Ridge, you didn't get far without pushing boundaries. So, when the crew came across a strange mound of earth one afternoon, Sam decided to have a look. They were supposed to be cutting down trees, not digging, but curiosity got the best of them. When the first shovel hit the ground, it didn't sound like dirt, it sounded like stone. The earth gave way, and soon they uncovered a series of ancient, weathered stones arranged in a circle. Inside the circle, they found something far worse: bones. Human bones. And not just any bones. These were old, far older than anything they'd seen before. There was a skull, large and misshapen, with strange markings carved into its surface. Sam Carson, ever the skeptic, didn't know what to make of it. But he knew one thing: it wasn't supposed to be here. And the more he and the crew dug, the worse it got. The bones weren't just human. They were something else, something unnatural. The air around them seemed to change, heavy with a tension that none of the men could explain. That night, the nightmares began. The first person to feel it was Sam's best friend, Marty. He'd been one of the men who helped uncover the bones, and now he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure standing in the woods outside his cabin. It was tall, shadowed by the trees, but its eyes, glowing red like fire, were unmistakable. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. Sam didn't believe him at first. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," he'd said. But as the days wore on, it became impossible to ignore. The nightmares spread, and it wasn't just Marty. The entire town seemed to be affected. People reported seeing strange things. Figures in the woods that weren't there when you looked again. Footsteps that followed you but never reached you. Whispers in the dark that carried on the wind. And then the deaths started. It was a small town. Everyone knew everyone else, and when someone disappeared, it shook the entire community. The first was a young woman, the daughter of a local shopkeeper. She had been out for a walk near the edge of town when she was found. There were no signs of struggle, no trace of where she'd gone. Just deep, heavy footprints in the dirt leading into the woods. Then more disappeared. One by one, the town's people were taken. Each disappearance was followed by strange occurrences. Freak storms, unexplainable fires, and the growing sense that something ancient, something forgotten, was waking up. The elders, the ones who had grown up hearing the old stories, began to whisper about it. The legend of the Bigfoot, the guardian of the burial site. The Bigfoot wasn't a simple creature, it was something more. A guardian, born from the land itself, bound to protect the sacred grounds where the bones had been buried. And it had been awakened. No one could explain it, but the terror was real. As the creature grew stronger, so did the supernatural forces tied to the town's forgotten history. The more people were taken, the more powerful the Bigfoot became, drawing from the anger and fear of those who had disturbed its resting place. Sam Carson knew something had to be done. He could feel the weight of the town's forgotten sins bearing down on him, and he knew that no one would be safe until the truth was uncovered. It wasn't just the Bigfoot they were fighting anymore. It was the sins of the past, the buried history of Pine Ridge that had come back to claim its due. The men of the town gathered, those who had survived the first wave of terror. They knew they had to return to the burial site and put things right, or there would be no town left. Sam, Marty, and a handful of others made their way back to the site where they had uncovered the bones, the place that had been left undisturbed for so long. The forest was darker now, as if it had been waiting for them. When they arrived, they found it as they had left it, except now there was something else. The Bigfoot stood there, towering and silent, its eyes glowing with an intensity that shook them to their core. And in the air there was a terrible weight. The land was angry. The creature was angry. The ground began to tremble beneath their feet as the Bigfoot stepped forward, its massive form moving with an unnatural grace. Sam could feel the pull of the land, the forgotten history seeping into his bones. He understood now. This wasn't just a creature of flesh and blood. It was a force of nature, a reckoning for the town's sins. It had been buried, forgotten for too long, and now it was demanding its revenge. The creature raised its arms and the wind howled through the trees, carrying the voices of the lost souls with it. The town had been built on blood, on secrets that had been buried in the earth, and the creature, the guardian, would not stop until it had taken back what was its own. Sam's mind was racing as the Bigfoot took a step closer. The ground beneath him cracked, and the trees groaned as if they were alive, as if they too had felt the weight of the past. "Do you feel it?" Marty whispered, his voice filled with terror. Sam didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could feel it too, the guilt, the fear, the history that had led them here, and the creature's wrath was only the beginning. In the end, it wasn't just the Bigfoot they had to face. It was the sins of the town, the forgotten past that had returned with a vengeance, demanding retribution. And as the creature's roar echoed through the woods, Sam realized that Pine Ridge would never be the same again. The past had come alive, and it was hungry.